I spoke with somebody that you know, and I said I was going to be interviewing you. And I said, okay, what would you like to have him talk about on YouTube? And this person said, non-self.
Non-self. Mm.
So I'm just going to say that and hand the ball over as a core teaching of the Buddha.
Yeah. Well, I would actually describe that as the core teaching of the Buddha. The most significant thing. And so, non-self, what can we say about it in a YouTube type?
Oh, he got an 8-minute thing on you. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, what makes this so important is that you have to remember that what the problem the Buddha was trying to solve, the disease the Buddha wanted to cure in people, was the suffering that he saw that characterized their lives. And when he looked at the causes of suffering, he saw that they arose out of craving, out of desire and aversion. And when he looked at desire and aversion, he saw that it arose out of this sense of being a separate self, being a separate entity. And if you think about that, desire and aversion are absolutely inevitable consequences of regarding yourself as a separate entity, separateness, selfhood. You divide the universe, you divide reality into self and everything else that's non-self. And however that boundary is defined in your mind, it becomes a battleground. There are things that if I have them will make this self happy, and there's things that there's things that can cause pain and make me unhappy. And so then this self is destined to be at war with all of the universe that's not self, trying to obtain happiness and avoid pain. Right? So this defines the problem, and you see that there's a certain inevitability of suffering. So really the question that I think the Buddha must have asked himself at some point is this really the way it is, or am I missing something here? Are people missing something here? And you have to recall that at the time that he lived, the common belief was not only the same common belief that we all have, that I am this separate self. And this is an inherent sense we have, and our mind has generated this whole idea of who we are. You know, I am this, I am that, these are my likes, these are my dislikes, this, and so on and so forth. So we have this inherent sense of being a separate self, plus we have our mind's defined idea of what this self is. And of course, everybody in his time was exactly the same way. They also had this concern that this separate self or soul, that when the body died, what would happen to it? And there was one school that said, well, when the body dies, the self is annihilated. And another school that said, well, when the body dies, the self will be reincarnated, like, you know, the soul will take on a new body and start it all over again. Which initially, if you're worried about what's going to happen to yourself, that might sound like, oh, that's pretty good.
I'll take that one.
I'll take that one, right.
God, keep coming back.
Except they've been believing that for a few thousand years, and
how's it working out?
a number of people started thinking, if I keep being reincarnated, I keep having to go through all this suffering and dying again.
Yeah.
So rebirth means re-death. This is not such a good thing after all. And so a lot of the concern at that time was to try to come to some sort of reconciliation with this. Is my precious self going to be destroyed when I die, or is my precious self going to be condemned to an eternal cycle of being reincarnated, suffering, and dying all over again just to repeat the process?
It's an either or for you.
With a lot of different, it's not, and it gave rise to a lot of different religious practices and beliefs about not only what was true metaphysically, but what you could do about it. Anyway, the important thing that the Buddha did is he came along and he said, you know, you've all got it wrong. There is no self. There is no self that's going to be destroyed when you die, and there is no self that is going to be reincarnated.
So you don't have to worry about it.
Well, but of course the problem is that doesn't do much to relieve the worry.
Yes. Well, that was probably disturbing to some people.
Yeah, and it still is
Say
today.
there's no self.
It's very disturbing to a lot of people today. And so to understand not self and to really grasp the significance of it is no simple thing. So what can I say right now to help people grasp the significance of it? And that is, every concept of self, no matter what version it is, it implies this separation. And that is where the problem is. This body and mind are real. They are constantly changing. They are not permanent. They are conditioned. They are the result of causes and conditions. They constantly change in response to causes and conditions. And for that matter, the idea that I have of what my body is and what my mind is and who I am, these are all concoctions of my mind. But they are still real on the relative plane. My body is still relatively separate from everything else, even though it's not absolutely. All the atoms and molecules of my body are constantly being exchanged with others. This mind that feels so separate seems to be confined inside my head or however my heart or whatever. It feels really separate, but it's not really. It is a part of a larger dynamic process, and everything that I know and think and believe I owe it to all of the different people that I've been in contact, and all of the uncountable billions of people that I've never been in contact who have contributed to, in one way or another, to the formation of my beliefs and ideas and the way I view things. And every single thing that happens to me modifies that. So, although this body and mind are genuinely separate in a sense, there is a sense in which they're not really. And that's what's important for us to pay attention to. We naturally tend to pay attention to the aspect of separateness rather than the aspect of being part of a much larger whole. And of course, it is that separateness that is at the root of all of our problems. So if we can give up the separate self, we gain everything. We gain the universe. We gain a whole. We gain something that is not doomed to perish in a few decades. So at the very least, I think anybody can recognize that it is the sense of separateness and the boundary that we create between ourself and others that is the source of our difficulties. So, but how do we overcome that? Because we have such a strong sense of being a separate self. Not only that, we have these compulsions, and that's what they are, compulsions, to do those things that serve for the survival and reproduction of this separate entity that I think that I am. And that's really what craving, desire, and aversion is all about.
Like an organism, what did they say in the brain study? Do I want to absorb it or spit it out? On a single cell organism.
Right.
It was still the same.
To absorb it
Or spit it out.
That's right. And that really gets down to it, doesn't it? Somehow life came into being. And from the time the very first cells formed, and formed a membrane that separated them from their environment, there was this incipient selfhood. And every single individual throughout the evolutionary history of life has been either behaves in ways that promote its own survival and reproduction, or it doesn't. And we're the result of that
the successful
process.
ones, yeah. Those are the
Yeah.
genes that have been handed down. Yeah.
The ones that are handed down are from the ones that
Survived, yeah.
survived, right. And so that's how we come into this world.
Uh-huh.
We come into this world. What is desire? Worldly desire. There's the desire for pleasure and to avoid pain. But we're programmed. Why does sugar taste sweet? There's nothing inherently sweet about sugar. And why do plant poisons taste bitter? We're programmed that way. We're programmed that way because for our ancestors to eat ripe fruit that contained the sugars that were beneficial to survival was a good thing. So we're programmed to do that. Now we drink soft drinks that have, huge amounts of sugar, and everything is
Nitrates
oversweetened.
and
It's not such a good thing.
Yeah.
But the reason that that's there is because it contributed to survival. And as a matter of fact, if you examine everything that produces pleasure or pain, you can see it has the reason that we respond by an experience of pleasure or pain is a programming that helped our ancestors to survive. Another aspect of desire is we want to acquire things and stuff and money, and we want to make sure that we don't lose all of our things and stuff and money when we get it.
George Carlin has a good riff on that.
Yeah, that's good.
Stuff.
I don't think I've heard George Carlin.
Have you heard George Carlin's one on stuff? Oh, it's good.
I should probably
You should,
hear that sometime.
The Dharma talk.
But George Carlin Dharma talks. Now that's a great idea.
There you go.
But you don't have to think about it very much to realize, well, yeah, if I have this compulsion to acquire material objects, it's going to improve my chances of survival, and it'll improve my chances of being able to obtain a suitable mate, and it will increase the chances for my offspring to survive. Mm-hmm. The other things that we want is we want social status. We want to be higher up in the social hierarchy. Humans are social beings. We're not isolated organisms with our own territory and we don't see anybody else. We are an integral part of our social units. And our social status is important. So we'd much rather have fame than infamy, right?
That is true. I have students, I say, what do you want to be? And they go famous.
Yeah.
Or rich.
Or even the ones that say, oh, I don't want to be famous, they still want to be held in high regard by their peers.
Oh, yeah.
It's, on some level, it's very natural. And well, of course, your standing in your social group contributes enormously to your survival, your well-being, your ability to select a mate, and your ability for your children to survive and do well. So it keeps coming back to the same thing. You want to be praised, not blamed, the same thing. So all of the things that we desire are rooted in the need for this self with its unique genetic makeup to survive long enough to produce offspring and continue the process. We have the unique minds we do as human beings because they have afforded us the ability to do exactly that very, very successfully. But we can look at the world right now and see that we've reached a very interesting impasse. We're too successful. The evolutionary processes that allow us to survive so well and to be so successful at mating and producing offspring are now one of our biggest problems.
Mm-hmm.
The world is getting too small. And the way I see this is that what this whole evolutionary process has done is it's created a kind of being with a kind of mind that is possible to go beyond biological evolution. And that's where we need to go, because biological evolution always has to end with this. A species that is so successful on those simple basic terms that it eventually destroys the environment and the habitat that it lives in. And so all of biological evolution inevitably has to lead to another kind of evolution that leaves behind what brought it there.
Yeah.
That's what we have to leave behind.
Mm-hmm.
Our desires and our aversions and our cravings, which are inborn compulsions, and which are supported by a likewise inborn sense of being separate from the whole, and of constructing in our mind an idea of who and what we are. Because for craving to operate, it must have a reference point. It must have a reference point to guide us in what it is we want to swallow and what it is we want to spit out. And so we have this. We have egos, and we have this inherent sense of being separate self. But we also have the capacity to go beyond that. And we also have the capacity to go beyond these inborn compulsions. And that's really what this path is all about. This is really what all the meditation that we do is intended to help us to be able to do, to go beyond, to bring ourselves to this next stage. When we cease to be so attached to the ego self, it greatly reduces the amount of suffering that we experience. It moderates enormously the amount of suffering that we inflict on other beings. And it sets the stage for us to be able to begin the process of undoing the enslavement to our craving that we experience. Now, that doesn't, being able to transcend the attachment to the ego does not eliminate the inherent sense of being a separate self, but it does allow us to
Puts it in a bigger perspective.
It puts it in a bigger perspective, yes, and it does allow us to begin to free ourselves. As I say, from I think enslavement is a good word. And we're enslaved to compulsions that we call craving, and as long as we take the ego idea that we hold as being real and genuine, we're not going to be able to do that. We may temporarily set those cravings aside. We may practice morality and generosity and patience.
But you still...
But, yeah, it's like...
as far as you can go with that until...
Yeah, you trim the leaves off, but they just grow back because the root is still there. So, but once you've overcome that, then you can begin to deal in a really meaningful way with the experience of craving. And once you do that, you see what the ultimate promise is of the Buddhist teaching, of the enlightenment of the Buddha, and the fact that human beings can become enlightened, is that even that inherent sense of separateness can eventually be overcome. That is the promise. That is what defines a person becoming what's called an arhat, or to become a Buddha.
Evolutionary leap.
It's an evolutionary
That the
leap.
meditation is a catalyst to help.
That's right. That's right. And there's 4 stages. You overcome the attachment to the ego construct. And then the next 2 stages, you overcome the enslavement to the compulsion of craving. And then in the final stage, you overcome that inherent sense of separate selfhood.
Sounds good.